Hello. Hi, thanks for being here today. I'm Jill Stukenberg. I'm an associate professor of English here at the UW-Stevens Point at Wausau campus. And I'm also a member of the Central Wisconsin Book Festival Committee. And we are so pleased to have author Lori M. Lee with us here today. She's here, of course, for this event, and she also will be here at 7 p.m. tonight for a second event. So I'd like to tell you a little bit about Lori Lee. Lori M. Lee is the author of science fiction and fantasy novels and short stories. She was born in the mountains of Laos, but was raised right here in Wisconsin. Her books include Pahua and the Soul Stealer, part of the Rick Riordan Presents series, published by Disney Hyperion. Pahua and the Soul Stealer recently won the 2022 Mythopoeic Society Fantasy Award for Children's Literature, and the Elizabeth Burr Warzala Award by the Children's Book Award Committee of the Wisconsin Library Association. Lee's other books include Forest of Souls and the sequel Broken Web, published by Page Street. She considers herself a unicorn fan, enjoys marathoning TV shows, and loves to write about magic, manipulation, and family. So a little bit more about the Central Wisconsin Book Festival, which is going on. It just started last night. Today it continues, and it will continue through Friday, Saturday, and Sunday. And out in the hall there are schedules where you can see all the other free events that are going on in 3 different cities and online over the next few days. All events are free and open to the public. And support for the 2022 Central Wisconsin Book Festival was provided through the Marathon County Public Library, Portage County Public Library, and Macmillan Memorial Library, the Community Arts Grant Program of the Community Foundation of North Central Wisconsin, with funds provided by, lots of people have helped us out here, the Wisconsin Arts Board, a state agency, the Community Foundation, and the B.A. and Esther Greenheck Foundation. We also received support in part by the Reuter Ware Law Firm, the Dudley Foundation, the Marathon County Public Library Foundation, the Portage County Public Library Foundation, the Covantage Cares Foundation, Whitewater Music Hall, the Marathon County Historical Society, Bound to Happen Books, and Yankee Bookstore. Whew, right, a lot of folks. So it is my pleasure to next introduce author Lori Lee.
Hi, everyone. Oh, geez. Thank you, Jill, for that introduction. And before I start, I just want to quickly say thank you as well to the Central Wisconsin Book Festival and the Marathon County Public Library and all the many partners that she just named off for having me and organizing, such an amazing event for lovers of literature from all over Wisconsin. So my name is Lori. And I don't even have to introduce myself because Jill did such a great job. So I am going to be talking about Pahua and the Soul Stealer today, which is my most recent release, published by the Rick Riordan Presents imprint of Disney Publishing. Let's see, Pahua and the Soul Stealer. Yep, there you go. Oh, nope, I see the screen back there. Pahua and the Soul Stealer is based on Southeast Asian mythology, specifically Hmong mythology. Now, what is Hmong? Seeing that Wisconsin has one of the highest populations of Hmong people in the United States, I probably don't have to tell you, but I'm going to anyway. So, the Hmong are an ethnic minority originating from China, but now spread out throughout Southeast Asia and the world, as evidenced by me standing here. But I was born in the mountains of Laos, which, if you're not familiar with, is a country in Southeast Asia. And now in Pahua and the Soul Stealer, she likes to share random facts about herself with the reader, like how she's afraid of the dark or how she doesn't know how to swim. So here's a fun fact about me. Because I was born in a mountain village that didn't keep birth records, I don't actually know my real birthday. I don't feel sorry for me. I think it's kind of hilarious, actually. The only thing that genuinely sucks about this is that I don't know my real zodiac. So I can't do those compatibility tests. And it's super important to me to know whether or not I would have been a match for Legolas from Lord of the Rings. Oh, well. Moving on. I knew from a very early age, like I'm talking 3rd, 4th grade, that I wanted to be a writer. I loved reading, especially ghost stories, but also fantasy and mythology, and all 3 of those play a really big part in Pahua. But the very first stories that introduced me to fantasy was Hmong folk tales, Hmong oral folk tales, which we called Nanowrimo. My brother and my mom would tell me and my other siblings these incredible stories about how the world was created, how the rooster got its crown, where rivers came from, much like how, for example, in Greek mythology, the seasons are explained through Persephone and Hades' story. I went through a massive Greek mythology phase, and their story was always my favorite. But these Hmong folk tales also included terrifying stories that I loved about vengeful ghosts, demons that wore the faces of tigers, and evil spirits that, if you weren't careful, would invite themselves to sit around your campfire. And if you'd like an idea of what I was like as a child, there you go. I bet you would have loved to babysit me. So it was not a surprise that the very first stories I wrote were ghost stories. Does anyone know who R.L. Stine is? Yes, wonderful, iconic. Okay, I was 10 years old and writing short stories about teenagers being possessed by vengeful ghosts and then being gruesomely murdered. And here's another fun fact. I've spent the last several months binging podcasts about haunted sanitariums, true crime, cold cases, witch hunts, all the dark and fantastical, macabre topics that you can think of, and I feel like I've come full circle. So these are just a few of my early influences. Fear Street, some Asian ones that I'm not sure anyone will understand, like wuxia movies, and Legend starring a very young Tom Cruise before he went. Yeah, okay, moving on. Pahua. Speaking of ghosts and fantasy, brings me back to Pahua. Pahua is about a girl with a very special ability. She can see spirits, and not in the I see dead people kind of way. Is that still relevant? Like, do you guys know what Sixth Sense is? I see a few nods. Okay. Highly recommend if you have not watched that. She doesn't just see ghosts, but she sees spirits of all kinds, like nature spirits, animal spirits, demons, guardian spirits. In fact, her best friend is a talking cat spirit that no one else can see. As you can imagine, seemingly talking to herself doesn't get her the best kind of attention. And on top of that, she's just moved to this completely new city, started in a new school. She's one of the few minority students at this school. So she's just got a lot on her plate. And the way that Pahua copes with all of this is by pretending to be someone else, someone more exciting, like a secret agent, or a lost princess, or a mad scientist. Since she already gets singled out by her peers, she reimagines herself as someone who stands out in a way that doesn't make her feel small. Then one day, Pahua accidentally untethers an angry spirit from the neighborhood haunted bridge, like you do, and when her brother suddenly falls sick and can't be awoken, she's afraid that the bridge spirit has stolen his spirit. So she grabs her aunt's old shaman tools and marches off to confront the bridge spirit and demand her brother's soul back, and instead she summons a demon, like you do. Thankfully, a shaman warrior named Zhang shows up and saves her. With Zhang's help, Pahua will have to find her way through the spirit world and rescue her brother's soul before it is too late. So when I first began thinking about the kind of world I wanted to create, in this book, one of the most important things for me was to do my research. The book is fiction, but because it was really important to me to make sure that I was interpreting these stories in a way that was still respectful to the Hmong culture and my beliefs, I knew I had a lot to do. Even though I grew up as being part of that culture, I still didn't feel like I knew enough to really be able to write a whole novel inspired by, the stories that I was told growing up. That's actually one of the reasons why it took me so long to even write a book that centers around my culture. Hmong culture has basically no representation in mainstream media. Most people didn't even know we existed until Suni Lee came onto the screen. And this is how I feel about her. So I felt this immense pressure to quote unquote get it right. But then I really just had to give myself permission to write my version with the expectation that it wouldn't meet everyone's approval. You're always afraid of not just backlash from an outside community, but from your own community, because that pressure of getting it right is so immense. But I told myself, I doubt George R.R. Martin is having this moral dilemma about the cultures and history that he pulls from in his books. And I was at a book festival this past weekend, and one of my author friends put it perfectly. She said, if George R.R. Martin can do it, then so can I. Anyway, so I drew inspiration from the Hmong folktales that my mom and my brothers told me when I was a kid, but I also did a lot of research online and in my local library, where I actually found a few volumes of our folktales which had been written down and printed, and that is extremely rare. These were published in like the 70s and the 80s, and they're like ridiculously difficult to get a hold of. So the fact that they were there was really awesome. And especially when I started reading it and I found stories that I had never even heard, which was very exciting. And, let's see, there we go. In the footsteps of my forefathers, I wanted to share a quick Hmong folktale that I incorporated into Pahua. The story is called The Orphan Boy and Ningo, and it was actually made into a low-budget movie several decades ago, which you can see here. I've never actually seen it, but I had to share this cover because, yeah. Also, for some reason, a lot of our folktales feature orphans. Not sure what that's about. So the story goes that there was this orphan boy who unfortunately doesn't get a name. He's always just Orphan Boy. One day, as he's sitting beside a lake feeling sad about how he doesn't have a family, doesn't have a home, it just so happens that beneath that very lake lived a beautiful woman named Ningo, which I'll call Pa for short, because frankly I am not fluent enough in Hmong to keep saying her name without shaming my ancestors. So Pa hears him crying and decides to confront him, and in doing so, they fall in love. But on the day of their wedding, the bride doesn't show up. Turns out her father is the dragon that lives inside that lake. And in Asian mythology, dragons are creatures of water, not fire. So her father, the dragon, found out what was going on. She found out his daughter was going to marry this orphan boy with no means, no family, no money, and that was not going to work for him. So he kidnapped her because obviously. 4 days, Orphan Boy sits by the water crying and begging for the dragon to release his daughter. Eventually, a nearby frog hears him wailing, and he decides to investigate. The frog asks, "What's wrong?" And Orphan Boy says, or he tells him everything that's happened, and the frog feels sorry for him. So he agrees to help him by drinking all the water in the lake so that he can be reunited with Pa. But there is one condition: the boy must not laugh. So the frog begins sucking up all the water and starts to blow up like a huge balloon. And what does Orphan Boy do? He laughs. Instantly, the frog's stomach bursts open and all the water spills back into the lake. The frog is furious that Orphan Boy broke his promise not to laugh, although I'm kind of unsure why he's not more furious that his stomach literally just burst open, but folktales are weird. The Orphan Boy begs him again for his help, and for some reason, the frog agrees. So Orphan Boy sews up the frog's stomach, and this time when the frog begins to balloon up, Orphan Boy holds it in and doesn't laugh. And then when all the water has been sucked out of the lake, it reveals Pa at the bottom. Orphan Boy jumps in, rescues her, and they live happily ever after. Now, because of the tradition of oral storytelling, where the stories are passed down verbally, the story can and does change depending on who is telling it. One version says that Orphan Boy seeks out the advice of a Hmong shaman and oracle named Shao, who often appears as a guide of sorts in our folktales, and who also appears in Pahua. Another version actually continues after the Orphan Boy finds her. In that version, Pa tells the Orphan Boy that her father, the dragon, has betrothed her to a sky prince, and he has to jump through all these hoops to try to get her out of it, and it's very nebulous whether or not they actually get their happy ending. So, excuse me. So I reimagined these characters for my book. Pa is actually a figure who appears in a lot of Hmong folktales, but she's always a victim of some sort. She's always passive, docile. She works hard in the fields every day. She cooks and cleans, takes care of the Orphan Boy's needs, and then she quietly concedes and just leaves, heartbroken, every time Orphan Boy inevitably does something stupid. And that just wasn't going to work for me. I wanted to give her some power back. I wanted to give her some agency of her own. So in Pahua and the Soul Stealer, I reimagined her as a trickster goddess who deliberately made these gullible human boys fall in love with her. And because the frog interfered by helping Orphan Boy, she actually punishes him by forcing the frog into service for the gods. It's kind of funny because after reading my book, my aunt called me up and she goes, "You know that Ningo Zhupa is a heroine, right?" And I was like, "Yeah." She's like, "Okay, because young kids are going to be reading this and they're going to think that she's evil." I'm like, "Well, I mean, I feel like that might be better." But first of all, our stories are fluid because they're oral traditions, and I love that. Second of all, bad guys are hot. And third, this is a fantasy novel. I always want to make that clear when readers go into the book that they shouldn't go into it expecting a textbook, lesson on Hmong culture, Hmong mythology. It's inspired by these stories and is inspired by my culture, but it is still fundamentally a work of fiction. Pahua's best friend is literally a snarky talking cat. And her world is populated by various nature spirits that my wildly talented friend brought to life with her illustrations. My favorite are the mushrooms. I adore them. Okay. So anyway, I researched and I wrote the book. So now what? Do you guys know who Rick Riordan is? Yes, Percy Jackson series is coming out. I'm so excited. Okay. The short of it is that, he writes these contemporary fantasy adventures based on various mythologies, primarily Greek mythology, with his Percy Jackson series. So several years ago, many years ago, I heard that he was heading a new imprint at Disney called Rick Riordan Presents. And when I saw that, I thought, wow, I would love to be able to publish with them. But I didn't write middle grade, I only wrote young adults. And little did I know. Flash forward a year, and I get this idea for Pahua, this girl who has to journey through the spirit realm and battle, spirits and monsters from Hmong mythology to save her brother. And I'm banging out the first draft faster than I've ever written a book, and I've written quite a few. And I'm having so much fun with it because I feel like middle grade, which is like the Harry Potter age group, I would say. It's just so fun. Like, I can embrace the silliness, I can embrace the goofiness. Pahua is 300 pages of dad jokes. But yes, I was just loving the heck out of it. And I tell my agent that my dream imprint for this book is Rick Riordan Presents. But here's the thing. I was terrified of admitting this to her because I felt like I was reaching too high. This wasn't even a thing I should even want because it was so impossible. I had mentally self-rejected before ever even trying. And so the moral of the story here is ignore Master Yoda's advice. There is a try. Don't self-reject. If you want it badly enough, always try. Don't be like me. Actually, be like me and then go for it. There you go. So anyway, I tell this to my agent, embarrassed for some ridiculous reason, like I'm admitting something shameful. And she simply responds, "Okay, we'll put together a proposal," and my mind instantly implodes. And then once I put myself back together again, I polished the first 100 pages or so. I wrote up a synopsis, and we submitted it to the editor at Rick Riordan Presents, who is Stephanie Lurie. She's my editor. She's amazing. And somehow, some way, she loved it. And then she passed it on to Rick Riordan, who read it and loved it. And then they passed it on to the acquisitions team. And if it's not clear, but manuscripts have to go through a lot of hoops before they get acquired by a publisher. Not just Disney. But yeah, they offered us a deal, and when my agent told me over the phone the moment I hung up with her, I burst into tears. That is how Pahua came to be, and now it is hopefully in adaptation for a TV series at Disney+. We're very, very early in the phase, very early, so fingers crossed. But yeah, and now, how much time do I have left? About. Oh. Well, thank you. I was gonna read a little bit from the book since I figured you guys might want to hear that. So feel free to nap if you don't. I usually have it bookmarked. Oh, there we go. All right, this is from chapter 2. I left the school, following the other girls across the playground toward the hiking trail in the woods. As we continued down the shaded path, the air grew cooler and the soft earth muffled our footsteps. Dandelion spirits with tufts of frothy hair emerged from the weeds to trot at my heels, trailing silver fluff. Tree spirits peered out from the hollows of trunks. They had bark for skin, stiff, spindly arms and legs, and nests of leaves and moss for hair. "Your name's Pahua, right?" June asked. Me was perched on her head now, doing his best impression of a hat. Yeah, I said. How'd you know? She smiled, flashing her braces. I pay attention. My dad says I'm good at remembering little details. I winced at the idea of my name being a little detail, but she probably didn't mean it to sound rude. Are you new here? I asked, eager to change the topic. Yeah, we're from Chicago. My dad is the new manager at Murdell Trucks. They take military vehicles, or they make military vehicles for the army and stuff. Not tanks, though, that would be cool. We've only been here like a month. It's so much quieter than in the city. Our old apartment was next to this bar that played local bands every Saturday, and my dad and I would dance. She kept going. And I tried to listen, honest, I did, because I wanted her to like me. But I could tell by the way my stomach grew heavier and heavier that we were getting closer to the bridge. Almost everyone I knew had a story about this bridge being haunted. To be fair, I didn't know a lot of people, and most of them were adults, like our neighbor Mr. Taylor, who always smelled like dog food. Also, the bridge looked like it should be haunted, with crooked wooden boards that had black mold and nails eaten through by rust. There was even a sign warning people away, but I was probably the only person in the whole town who could say with absolute certainty that the stories were true. Yeah, unfortunately, I can see human spirits too. All human spirits are creepy, at least they are to me, but most of them are harmless. The recently dead, waiting for the funeral rituals that would release their soul into Date, the spirit realm, just sort of mope around, looking depressed. Not that I blame them. The older spirits who, for one reason or another, were never released, mostly keep to themselves, scaring the locals only on rare occasions. I don't blame them either. If I was stuck in one place for all eternity, I'd find my fun however I could do. But then there are the genuinely scary ones. They're literally the worst. My guess was that the bridge spirit was one of those. I'd never been close enough to the bridge to find out for sure. But I'd always gotten a bad feeling whenever I walked anywhere near it. My mom had warned me to stay away from there, and before today, I'd obeyed. The sensation gnawed at my insides made the hair stand up on the back of my neck and filled me with a cold so intense it burned. People who are attuned to spirits can be affected by them even if they can't see or hear them, and I'm especially sensitive. I was picking it up already, the awareness of something very old and very angry. According to folks around town, the spirit who haunted the bridge was a kid who died there after her parents abandoned her in the woods. Judging by how I was feeling, I could believe it. I shivered, rubbing my arms where goosebumps had risen. We'd caught up to the other girls. Haley glanced at me, her nose wrinkling like she'd smelled something bad. Are you cold? June asked, giving me a funny look. It was the hottest part of the year, and all four of us were in t-shirts and shorts. No, I said, dropping my arms. Maybe we could just hang out here? I gestured to an old tree that had snapped in half last spring. It rested at an angle, propped up by sturdier neighboring trees. It would have made a perfect ship, or fallen tower, or drawbridge. If you don't want to come with us, then leave, Haley said. Jocelyn smirked and whispered loudly, she's definitely scared. Of your face, I thought. Mee's whiskers twitched like he knew what I was thinking. Even though June gave them both an annoyed look, I could tell she was disappointed in me. That made me feel worse than anything Haley or Jocelyn were saying. Maybe we weren't meant to be friends. It would be easy to just turn around and go back. By the time school resumed in the fall, June would understand that I didn't fit in and would never try to invite me anywhere again. But she had invited me, and she'd stood up for me twice. No one but me and Matt ever did that, so I stayed. As we walked, the cat spirit settled onto my shoulder, tucking his head beneath my ear. I put my arms behind my back to hide the way my skin prickled as the chill spread inside me. Maybe Pahua, 11-year-old nobody, was scared of a bridge, but I didn't have to be her right now. I'd pretend to be someone braver, a warrior princess setting out to vanquish an evil sorcerer, or a secret government experiment, part machine and part vampire bat, bent on destroying the mad scientist who'd created me. My imaginings broke off when we reached the bridge. The trees ended at a steep bank studded with rocks. The tree spirits had gone quiet, and the dandelion spirits had peeled away some time ago. I told myself all that was normal. Lots of earth-based nature spirits didn't like water spirits, which were particularly nasty. The cold inside me became a sick, sinking feeling like the ground beneath my feet had turned to quicksand. There was something here that wasn't right, something that was not to be disturbed. Like an idiot, I ignored it. And that is your intro. Thank you very much for listening. If you have any questions, I'm happy to answer them for the remainder of the time, which I think is 10 minutes. Nothing. Wow. Okay, yes. Yeah. Yes. Pahua will have 2 sequels, and I am working on the second book. It will hopefully come out next year. I just got an email from my editor yesterday saying, I can't believe it's that time, but we've got to start working on the cover for the sequel, and I'm pretty excited about how that's going to go.
Will you be on the show that Disney is creating?
Disney Plus?
Yeah.
The TV series?
Yeah.
It is being adapted for Disney Plus, yes.
Ah. So are you going to be on it?
Would I be on it?
Yeah.
No. I mean, it would be super cool if I had a cameo, but acting is not my strong suit. I do have executive producer, what's the word, like rights, I guess, but I mean, all that means is I get a voice in the writer's room, which is, I don't get final say, but I do get input.
So I have written down some of the questions we came up with in class the other day, and I'll say them out loud unless, if you're feeling too shy. At least 2 different students wanted to know, because we in class read your story, Steel Skin, from the book Beginnings and 1,000 Beginnings and Endings. And so after reading this story, a couple of students wanted to know if you're a gamer and if you played Detroit Become Human.
I have not played that, but I am a gamer, yes. Right now, I mostly just play World of Warcraft. Yeah, I'm that kind of gamer geek. So, yeah.
All right, you gotta know what class.
My main is a priest, undead priest, horde.
Sure. So here's another one. Well, I guess they wondered if you don't mind saying something more about Steel Skin, the story, and which is a fantastic story that appears in an anthology called 1,000 Beginnings and Endings, just for anyone listening online or looking for that. They wondered if that story also has inspiration in Hmong folklore or mythology, and if you'd mind saying something about that.
Yeah, sure. So I wrote that, gosh, I don't even know how many years ago. But I sort of gave myself permission to begin to trickle in parts of my culture into my stories. So, like, for example, Force of Souls, which was my YA book, it came out in 2018, I think. Was it 2018? Gosh, it's been so many years. Everything pre-pandemic is like a lifetime ago, so I apologize. But it included some Hmong cultural references like food, social hierarchies, some customs, but it was in effect a secondary world fantasy. They're like all the characters were coded Asian, but they were not Asian because there's no such thing as Asian in a fantasy world, a secondary world fantasy. But I wrote that book, and I wrote it that way because I had grown up not seeing myself in any of the fantasy books that I absolutely loved, and it definitely affected me as a kid, like internalizing this idea that I don't belong in these stories. So I didn't want that, and I wrote this fantasy with Asian characters in it that were just Asian, like it's populated by Asian characters just because. It's not inspired by an Asian culture, it's not an Asian fantasy, which I love Asian fantasies, don't get me wrong, but this one was just a fantasy novel that happened to have Asian characters. And so with that idea, I sort of went into Steelskin with that same, concept. Like the characters, they are coded Asian. The city of, it's been a really long time since I've read that book. I think it was called Vinay. That is actually one of the refugee camps that my family and I were in when we fled Laos during the Vietnam War. So there were inspirations, for sure, and like they were meant to be coded that way, but again, it is a secondary world sci-fi in that case. So yeah, that was, I don't know if that answered your question.
No, thank you.
Yeah, and then I guess, building on that, the next short story I wrote was, again, it's been a really long time, Stardust and Moonbeams, which was in the anthology Color Outside the Lines. And that was the first time I wrote a character who was specifically Hmong. And that one was about a boy who is a fallen star. Yeah, I would also recommend that, please. And then with Pahua, that was the first time I gave myself permission to write an entire book, based on Hmong culture and with Hmong characters and going into this world that is inspired by Hmong mythology. Like I said before, I was afraid of not getting it right. I was afraid of, that pressure. But the other side of that was that I just didn't think it was what people would want to read, because I grew up reading fantasies that were populated only by white characters. And if there was an Asian character or an Asian coded character, they were the foreigner from a distant land. They were the exotic side character. They were the butt of the joke or whatever. And so I wrote all my stories featuring white people because I thought that's what I had to do. Luckily, that is changing, Publishing is finally catching up, and there's a lot of books coming out now that feature, a lot of diversity, and it's a really good time to be in publishing, so I'm grateful. Yes.
I guess you can talk really loud too. Oh, there are people online that won't hear you. Oh, okay. Thank you. Sorry. Speaking of publishing, I know you've been writing for a long time, and I know jumping from hobby writing or just writing in general to publishing is a big step. And I understand that a lot of, even with Pahua and the Soul Stealer, you had some things holding you back from publishing that. How did you feel publishing even your first work?
So, like I said previously, I knew that I wanted to be a writer since I was very young. But, when I was a kid, we didn't have the internet. And we didn't have access to that kind of information, like how I would even go about getting published. So I mostly just worked on, writing, and I wrote a 300-page fantasy novel by hand, and I had like a massive callus on this finger that I was stupidly proud of. But eventually, I kind of understood that I wasn't ready to be published. I just didn't think my writing was good enough yet. So I got to college and I majored in creative writing, minored in web design because I'm not about the starving artist. And then I worked on my craft a lot. And I will say though, and this is a terrible thing to say given that I'm in the middle of a UW campus right now, a university, but I learned more about writing from the fan fiction community than I did from my college courses. I'm sorry, but it was true. My college courses were great. I loved my professor, she was amazing. But writing fan fiction, learning from some of the best writers that I've ever read, taught me so much about character and plot and pacing, and all that stuff. And like ultimately, it taught me ultimately it is all about character, because people, if you love a character from any series, you'll follow them literally anywhere. You can just read a slice of life fanfic about them and you'll love it, because it's all about character. He's like laughing because I'm using all these terms. He's like, "You're such a geek." I know.
I'm laughing because it's true.
It is true too. So I was writing fan fiction for a number of years, and I really loved it. And then it sort of dawned on me one day that I was just like, I need to shift gears, because I've been writing, fan fiction for so long, and while I love it and it's taught me so much and it was vital to my journey, it's not ultimately where I want to be. But I did meet, my best friends in fandom, and we all stay in touch. We talk every single day. We all got matching Lord of the Rings tattoos last time we were together. But yeah, I had to move on from that. Well, not necessarily move on, but to stop making it such a huge part of my writing. So I think it was 2010, I decided to jump in with NaNoWriMo, and that is National Novel Writing Month. For anyone who doesn't know, it's November of every year. Basically, people sign up to write 50,000 words in 1 month, and it's intense. So I figured if I'm gonna jump in, I'm just gonna jump, both feet in it at once. And I was able to complete that 50,000 words, and I was completely burned out afterward, and I couldn't touch that novel for like 6 months. But it did teach me some very important things. It taught me that, one, I'm not a pantser, which is what we call someone who just writes by the seat of their pants. I am a plotter, so now I know I have to thoroughly plot out my stories before I can jump into writing it. That was important for me to know. And second of all, and most importantly, was the accomplishment of having done it. Like, I wrote 50,000 words in 1 month. I did it once, I can do it again. So I needed that confidence to keep going, basically. That was, if for no other reason, if you're interested in being, a novelist, I think that's a great way to just it's like a crash course, basically, in figuring out what works for you, or what doesn't work for you. Yeah, and then I finished that, and luckily by that time we did have the internet. So I was able to, search blogs, search other authors, search for agents. I learned all about, the different avenues of publishing, whether I needed an agent or not, and I went from there. But yes, fan fiction was my foundation before transitioning. Yes.
So you mentioned that, a friend had given you advice that if George R.R. Martin could do it, so could you. And the thought that brought to my mind was, clearly in your book you have this coalescence of really beloved folk tales and the modern era, and in Martin's fiction it's really a strange bedfellows of the English War of the Roses and various other conflicts in English history, plus almost sort of the Age of Exploration with Daenerys' journey through Essos. And I was wondering, what is your opinion on that combination of cultures and time periods that would not necessarily have met in a fantasy setting? Westeros was inspired by England. It's in the 1400s, and in the 1400s, England didn't have contact with the Far East, which we see in A Shot by the Shadow. And in your book, it's not that common to find among shaman in the 21st century. So what's your opinion on, or even advice about, writing fiction that is a combination of time periods and cultures that never would have met, and can it be done in a fantasy setting without, or in a way that creates something new as opposed to just putting puzzle pieces together that don't fit?
That's a really good question. and now my brain has gone blank. So thank you for that. I think it comes down to what your story is about, because it also comes down to your process, I guess. Because whether you create a setting first and then put characters into populate it, or whether you create a character first and then create a world around that character. I guess you have to decide what you want to do, what your purpose is, what the plot is, and everything sort of serves that. Let's see, for example, Forest of Souls, I knew that I wanted to write a secondary world fantasy, because my debut book, which was Gates of Thread and Stone, it was originally meant to be a post-apocalyptic sort of mash between sci-fi, fantasy, cyberpunk. And I had to change it to be just straight fantasy, because editors were like, we don't know how to promote this book that is a little of everything. So unfortunately, I had to change it to be straight fantasy. But after that, I said, I want to write a book that is a secondary world fantasy, epic high fantasy, because that's what I grew up falling in love with. So I began to put together, different pieces of this world. And I researched, different, not necessarily countries, but different, like specific countries or specific time periods. But I researched different, what's the word I'm going for? Well, different, government structures, I guess. Different, I'm a writer and I don't have words. I didn't want to zone in on one specific, culture or place or time. I just sort of drew together like things that I thought were interesting, like the system of having a shogun, I guess, and a samurai in Japanese history, or which is very similar to the system of having a lord and serfs and knights in medieval England. So it wasn't necessarily a specific time period, a specific culture, but like certain structures that I thought were interesting, and bringing them into the world, and then putting fleshing it out in a way that worked for mine. And I don't know if that answers your question or not. But that is how I did it. So if you are in love with a certain period, with a certain culture or a time in history, I would just say, do a ton of research. And if it's a fantasy, then, just pull what works for you, what works for the story, and work with that, because ultimately everything should serve the story. You don't want to create a setting and then shove a plot into it. You know what I mean? You want to create your story. You want to have your goal, your main plot, and then build around it.
That brings up a second question then. You said that your writing is very character focused, and the things that you had previously written were more so character focused. What's your opinion on the idea of the setting as a character, of the setting having almost the feeling of being alive and participating in the story, as opposed to just being the backdrop for things happening?
I love that, actually. I love it when a book has a setting that is so integral that it becomes its own character. Okay, Forest of Souls, has a place called the Deadwood, and it is a ancient forest full of dead trees that is possessed by vengeful spirits, and nobody goes in because you're not going to come out again. The trees eat people. And it is what I hope is a strong presence in the book. It is constantly a looming threat. It is not just a physical barrier, between one side of the country and the other side of the country, it is also like a mental barrier between the ability of all these varying countries to ally themselves with each other. So, and of course, my main character has to go right into the heart of it, you know, because why put it there if you're not going to go into it, right? So my hope with that is that the Deadwood becomes such a presence, such an oppressive presence, that you really feel the main character's fear and apprehension when going into there. And she has a lot of, you know, close calls in there, and she absolutely hates it. And I hope the readers will feel the same way. I think another book that does an amazing job with that, I don't know if you guys have read it, it's called The Daughter of Smoke and Bone by Laini Taylor. But it's set in Prague. And the way that she describes the city is just phenomenal. And I wish now that I had a quote. But she just describes everything in such amazing detail that you feel like you're there. It feels like a very heady, very a very heady place that you can literally just like, you can like dive into the book and see the architecture, and like she talks about a bridge, and like it is also very integral to the story, like why they are in Prague. But yeah, so I would recommend that as well. But yeah, I love it when settings are important to the plot. I think that's great. I think that's necessary. But when they become their own character, it's amazing. Hi.
Hi. I have a question about how you said that you were more of like a plotting writer.
Yes.
How do you like organize that in your head? Because I imagine like writing a whole entire book. I imagine when I'm writing, I struggle, like not just like what you said, like a fly writer. I just like write what comes to mind first, and then I struggle like with the whole big picture. And I would, if you have any suggestions on how you would organize that better.
Sure. So what I do is I break the story down into 3 acts. Actually, I do 4 acts now. I used to do 3 acts. I do 4 acts because my Force of Souls editor was like, I'm introducing you to the 4-act structure. I'm like, yes, this makes so much more sense. So the first act is sort of like the inciting incident. You sort of like, you know, establish who the character are, what the setting is, and present what the issue is. And then the second act is like, you know, the character choosing to act, and sort of building up to the midpoint. And the midpoint is usually the part where the characters fail. That's usually people always use Star Wars A New Hope as like the example, right? The first act, you establish Luke lives on Tatooine, and I'm showing my geek again, but like, you know, you establish who he is, you know, you kind of like learn about the problem, or the villains, I guess. And then you start, that's the status quo. It establishes the status quo. And then the second act, you know, he finds this droid, and he finds out his dad was a Jedi, and he makes the decision to leave Tatooine and, you know, go rescue the princess. And then the third act, they're actually there, they're struggling, they're locked inside that, I can't even remember what it's called, compost room, whatever. And they're trying to fight back, and they're sort of losing, right? And then the final act is when they actually go and they destroy the Death Star. So I don't know if that makes sense to you. So like, it really helps me to break it down into smaller pieces. I'm probably not a great example though, because my outlines are like 50 pages. So I'm kind of excessive. So I break it down into acts, and then I break that further down into scenes. And then I actually like write down pieces of dialogue that comes to me, what I actually want to get across in that scene. And by the time I'm finished, I literally have like a novella of just the outline. But that's important for me to feel comfortable jumping in and writing. Like, I wouldn't recommend you guys spend, time writing 50 pages of an outline before jumping in. You just got to do what works for you, and that works for me. But yeah, I find breaking it down into chunks, like looking at the big picture and then breaking it down into chunks really helps. Because when I'm writing and I don't know what comes next, the outline is vital. I'm just like, I'm not really feeling it. I don't know I don't really feel inspired to put these words down, but the outline is there, so I at least know what I'm supposed to be writing, and that helps me continue to go. But I do also want to say that you don't have to stick 100% to your outline. A lot of pantsers, a lot of why they don't like the outline is because they feel like they're being restricted by it, confined by it, and they want all the creative freedom. Like, but it's your outline. I mean, change it however you want. You're not confined to anything. But yeah, I hope that helps.
Yeah, that's very helpful. Thank you.
We'll take one last question.
I was really curious, what was your inspiration for Miv the cat?
This is gonna sound really dumb and simple, but I have 3 dogs, and I always wanted a cat. My husband doesn't want cats. He doesn't like that they shed everywhere. He doesn't like that they jump on things. I'm like, cats are so cute though. That's their thing. But yeah, so I was just like, I want a cat. I'm gonna give her a cat. And that is literally the only reason why I created that character. Not everything has to be serious. Sometimes you can just do it because you want to, or because you think it's cool. I have a friend who writes sci-fi, and we joke about how she gets asked, "Oh, what inspired you to create this particular feature of your world?" She's like, they want a deep, thought-provoking response, but I just did it because I thought it was cool. Sometimes it's just because it's cool. Yeah.
I always thought that the best stories were ones where somebody had a small companion with them, just to really ground them.
Sure.
So that's pretty amazing.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you for having me. Thank you for coming.